Well folks, we're going to be starting it on part 2 of the Toro Parkway Sickle Bar mower. As you can see, I have the chassis down here on the lift table in the garage, and there's a bunch of stuff I have to address on this before the engine goes back into it, such as the cutter bar is going to have to be all pulled apart, cleaned up and greased. The clutch for the cutter is going to have to be taken care of, the sickle bar that is, right over here. I have to rebraze this arm back together as I'd mentioned in part 1. Drive system's going to have to get cleaned up and oiled. Luckily enough, the drive system for the sickle bar is still moving. That's not seized or anything. And I also have a new set of tires coming from this too that I just ordered offline. I was going to put the Gravely gear reduction wheel tires on here, the used ones, but they're also not in the best shape. And for the price that I got the new tires for, it was worth just retiring this thing and putting some good rubber on it. So anyways folks, let's get started. So the first thing that I'm going to see about doing is getting the sickle bar clutch off of here. This is the drive clutch here, and it is looks like it's a cone style clutch as far as I can tell inside of here. Of course we're going to find out once we pull it all apart, but I'm going to have to figure out how to get this off of the main shaft that goes through here. And of course, worst case, if I can't get it off of there, I might have to just pull the counterweight and the drive arm off the other side, and I can slide everything through. So let's see if we can kind of pick our way through this and get this thing off of here. So as you can see here, I have all my clutch components off, the fork and everything else. So what I did is after I took this bolt out of the end of it, I ended up cleaning up the shaft with a little bit of sandpaper and putting some penetrating oil on it. And luckily enough, driving it this way, hitting it on the back here with a dead blow hammer, this clutch is starting to move off of this shaft. So I'm going to just keep hitting it until we can get it off the shaft, and then we can get it over to the bench and finish disassembling it and take a look at it. So after a little more hammering, this thing has loosened up on the shaft, as you can see, and it started to come apart. So I'm going to see if I can take this apart in pieces versus the whole unit itself. And it's not a tapered cone clutch like I thought it was. Different style on the inside. It's flat, and it looks like it has shoes with these arms, which are cams, and the shoes push out inside of the drum. I just have to figure out how to get the cam assembly off of this shaft. Alrighty, the clutch is off the shaft here, and as you guys can see, I have 3 Woodruff key cuts. I have one there, that's a skinny one, I got a fatter one, and then I have another skinny one that's 180 degrees from the other skinny one. So these 2 Woodruff keys on the side are the ones that go through the clutch assembly. And unfortunately they were missing. There was nothing left in there when I pulled it apart, so somebody must have worked on this years ago, never put the Woodruff keys back in, and all I did was they socked down the set screws onto the shaft above the keyway opening, which kind of stinks because it ended up sort of mugging up the shaft a little bit there. But we're going to file those out and get those cleaned up, because this one on the other side is in pretty darn good shape still, and this one's messed up. So we'll be able to make those work, and we'll get some Woodruff keys back in there. And then the clutch itself here, everything looks to be in nice shape. And as I said, I thought this was going to be a cone clutch, but it looks like it's just a regular old, I don't know what this would be called, sort of clutch. And it has these arms that come up, as you can see, they're little cams, and they'll pivot and they push up on which would be the clutch plate or the clutch drum, I guess. I don't know what the technical term for this would be, because this piece is cast in such a way where you can see it has a stanchion on that leg and a stanchion, well, on this pad, and a stanchion on this pad, but the ends of them are open. As you can see, they're cut straight through. So that way it gives it something to flex with. When these cams open up, it'll flex this shoe open, and then this one the same way. And then this piece here is what pushes your clutch open. You can see the taper on the inside, and then of course this, I guess you could call it yoke, where the fork goes, because that rides inside this groove. and then this would push in on those arms, which would push the shoes open, which would grab inside of this drum like so, and that would engage your clutch. I know it's not all the technical terminology, but hopefully you guys will get a basic understanding on how that works. So I was looking inside of the lining, and it is pretty well worn down. There are brass rivets inside of here, and there's just enough lining left where I'm going to leave it as is versus trying to reline it. It probably has about a 1/16 or so left before it's down to the rivet, but for as much as I'm going to use this thing, I'm not really going to worry about it all too much, and I can always replace that down the line sometime. So we're going to run all this stuff through the parts washer, get this all degreased, and then I'm going to see about cleaning this up as well, because unfortunately this is sort of put together in such a way where it's either a one-time use or you got to buy parts every time you do it, because these shoulder bolts that go through here are stamped on the back so that way you can't get them out. And I suppose I could always work them out of there and then put them back in with Loctite and set them that way they don't back out. But we'll see. I'm going to see if I can leave them in there and free everything up the way it is. If I have to pull them out, I'll pull them out. But let's start by getting everything cleaned up, and we'll go from there. The Sickle Bar drive clutch is all squared away, cleaned up nicely inside the parts washer. As you can see, the lining inside of this drum is all degreased right back down to the brass rivets, but like I said, there's just enough room left there to do what I want to do with this thing. And then the clutch drum itself, I guess you could call it, that's all cleaned up. I took some sandpaper to the face of it, and that cleaned up nicely. There was a little bit of pitting, but it's so minute that it's not really going to make a difference on this. It'll still grab nicely. I got the cams all freed up. Those are flopping around nicely now. I didn't have to pull these shoulder bolts out. I got some oil in behind them and just kept working the cams back and forth until they loosened up. And I also have the adjusting bolts, although I took those out, greased them up, so those are all ready to be put back into adjustment. And the other components are all set, the yoke and whatever this piece would be called, the correct terminology for it. So that's all ready to go back on. I'm going to leave it off for now, just for the sake of what we're going to be doing next. And just as a side note, I also made some new woodruff keys for the shaft as well. As you can see, I have one there, and then I have the one that goes 180 degrees from that over here. So now that clutch will actually grab this shaft, and it won't be just relying on the set screws to hold it on there. So I got the cuts all cleaned out and everything, the woodruff key cuts, so those are all trued up. And we have some nice tight keys in there, so that'll hold it nice. So the next thing I'm going to do is pull this actuator lever off of the Sickle Bar down the side, get this stuff disassembled with the exception of taking the weight off of the shaft, get this all cleaned up, and then I'm also going to take off the levers down here as well, because this Sickle Bar does move, as you can see. Luckily it's not all seized up, but I want to make sure everything down here is nice and greased up, so that way when I go to use it, it won't wear out or seize up or anything like that. And then if I have enough room in here in the time, I'm also going to pull the sickle knife bar out as well today. Get the rust off of that the best I can, see if I can get an edge on some of these knives, and then get the bar here all cleaned up to the best of my ability. So anyways folks, let's start getting that squared away. So this actuator arm here on the side is held on with 2 bolts, top and bottom, and they are left-hand threads on here. And I'll show you guys once I get it off of here. But the nuts that I'm loosening up in the wrong direction because it's left-hand thread. These have little nubs on the bottom, and then this piece of sheet metal is peened in such a way where it has a point that sticks up into the teeth on these nuts, so that way you can snug it down accordingly and the nuts won't back themselves off, and you can tighten it up for the necessary adjustments. So this has got there's 2 pieces that come over onto this casting right here, in there. They got little, almost like knuckles on the bottom, like a ball of your knuckle, and it sits inside of this casting piece. So I just gotta see if I can pry it apart somehow to get it to come out of there. There we go. And then the one down here is a similar setup, almost like a joint for a shoulder, you know, a human shoulder. So here's how the end of the rod attaches. As you can see, ball and socket on this end down by the sickle bar, and then a kind of a similar setup up the top here, and then the bolts that go into them, left-handed thread, and you can see the teeth, if it focuses, on the bottom of the nut there. So those teeth will grab this stamped piece of sheet metal here, so that way you can snug it down accordingly and it won't back off during use. Now here I was thinking that was bolted through there, but it looks like it's just a pivot point that drops in to this knife bar. Yep. That's it. All of the actuator lever parts have been pulled off of the sickle bar, and the knife bar is loose inside of the sickle head. So looking these pieces over here, I do have brass bushings inside of this arm right here. So what I'm going to do is get everything scraped out of it for all the grease and whatnot, run these through the parts washer again like I did the clutch, and then see what these bushings look like and see how loose it is on that shaft. And if they're at the point where I can replace them and I can get these size bushings, I might go ahead and replace them depending on how much play is in there. And then this other piece here that attaches to the knife bar has a brass bushing in it, like so right there, and it's pretty well hammered from over the years. You can see it's kind of oblong, so I may or may not replace that too. But what I don't know is whether this pin that sticks out is supposed to be tapered or whether it's just worn. And if I had to make a guess, it's probably just worn, because it looks more worn on that side than it does in that direction. So we'll have to see. All the actuator parts are cleaned up nicely in the parts washer. So I haven't measured any of the bushings on this thing. I'm going to wait until I get the rest of the sickle bar cleaned up. But just as a side note, you can see that's brass all the way down through. But the top bushing, you can see, has also been pushed down, whether it was just from use or somebody sending it down into there. And there is a grease fitting hole right there, but the brass bushing is blocking it. So we're going to have to see if we can get that to move if these don't have to be replaced. That way I can get a grease fitting in there. And I noticed there was a bunch of grease fittings missing from this machine too, and some of the original guards as well. So there's a fitting missing there, there's a fitting missing there. I think both of these are threaded, and those took fittings as well. So those are all going to have to get replaced when this goes back together. And then the actuator pivot that goes up top by the counterweight, that's all cleaned up. The grease cup, I blew all the old grease and everything out of that. Bolts and the cap for the arm. The bolts for the arm, the cap for this piece here. So I took the sickle bar out, the knife bar, and I want to get this all cleaned up before I start assessing what's going to have to get rebushed and what fits where and what is worn out. So I'm just going to end up wire brushing this up. I'll see if I can clean up the surface where the knife bar rides on the guards, or the clips on top, and then the wear plates, and get those as cleaned up as well as I can. I don't think I'm going to do much with these guards here and try to clean those up where the knife edge is. I'll just kind of rely on cutting with this thing to get it cleaned up, since I'm not going to be using it on a commercial basis or for doing jobs. It's going to be mainly for display and taking to shows and putzing around with. So here's the knife bar itself. The knives on this thing aren't in too bad a shape. I'll put an edge on them with the grinder. Some of them have been, as you can see, sharpened over time. Whether it'll pick it up or not, it is dipped just on the side there, and a few of the other ones are the same. So I'm not going to bother replacing them. Some of them are sharpened to a point, some of them are still have the full knife to them, and of course I have to get this cup cleaned up here where the pivot goes in for the knife bar. So I'm going to work on that, folks, get everything cleaned up, and then we can kind of halfway put everything together and reassess what has to get bushed, what doesn't have to get bushed, and what we can reassemble in the meantime. Well, the knife bar cleaned up pretty reasonably decent. Somebody did replace knives on these over the years, which I kind of figured once I got it cleaned up you could really see where all the rivets have been done, and they're definitely not factory rivets on here. And this thing's got a lot of use on it, judging by some of the wear on it on the drive system and on the Sickle Bar drive system as well. So I got these things wire wheeled, as you guys saw, and then I ran a flap disc over them to see if I could smooth them out a little bit more and then put an edge on them. They're not the sharpest things in the world, but my skin is catching the edge of it, so that'll be plenty to cut some hay or weeds or whatever I can find to dig this thing into in the springtime. So we'll get this slid back into the sickle head here, like so. And everything cleaned up pretty well too in the track, as you can see. And all this, the rest of the rust on here, the surface rust, the light stuff, all the crusty stuff is gone, but that'll all blast off of there once you start using this thing and get some oil onto it and you start cutting vegetation. That'll wear off in due time pretty darn quick. But I just wanted to get the heavy stuff off, that way I can move this around like so. And some of these knives are, when you look at them, you know, they're like this. They're not the most straightest things in the world, and I also did my best to straighten out this knife bar as well, because it had a little bit of a ding in it right around here. It kind of went up like this. So I got most of that out, and it has a bit of a warp to it, but like I said, I'm not going to be using it for cutting acres of hay and whatever else. It's just going to be a display thing at the tractor shows and just to play around with. So I'm pretty happy with this right now. We have an edge on our teeth, so what we're going to do is loosely reassemble the actuator lever stuff over on the side here, and then see what we're going to have to do to rebush anything, or if we're just going to leave it the way it is. Before I go and reassemble this thing, I just wanted to show you guys, as I had mentioned earlier, the pin on the bottom of this thing does have a bit of a taper to it, and it's also kind of worn oblong, as you see, and that is supposed to be just a straight pin all the way down. It's a 7/8 diameter pin. And then this bushing here that it sets in, obviously enough, you can see that someone has messed around with it, and it looks like they slammed a piece of copper pipe down inside of a already homemade copper bushing that was inside of here. You can see there's two lips there. There's an OD and an ID, and it looks like someone has two homemade bushings stuck down inside of there. So unfortunately, I am going to leave this just the way it is for as much as this thing's going to get used. And being that I'm kind of cheap, I don't feel like having one of these pins made, and unfortunately, nor do I have the machine tools to make one, lathe, Bridgeport, or what have you. So this is going to stay as it is, and it'll work for what I want to do with it. And then this arm goes over this piece here, that pin, and as you can see, this has got quite a bit of play in it where those brass bushings are. So what I am going to do is look up these bushings. Should be a pretty standard size for the age of this thing, and see if I can get some new brass bushings to press into here, so at least this arm is shored up, because it takes a pretty good brunt of the force, because that's where the actuator lever goes up to the drive shaft right there. So I'll look those up, and maybe I'll be able to get those local from the bearing place that I use around here, and then we'll have some new bushings in this arm. While I'm waiting for the bushings to come in from the bearing company, I'm going to start in on this drive system here. And as you can see, it's a jack shaft chain driven down to a differential, and there is a differential inside of this hub right here, so that way you can make turns and all that. So when I first got this unit, you used to be able to move the drive lever right here, which is connected to all this stuff, and that'll flip this piece here where the jack shaft is. This casting would flip forward and back to tension the belt up against the engine pulley, and obviously that's since seized, because this thing's been sitting outside for probably the better part of almost 2 years now since I had it. So what it does is it ends up pivoting on this axle here. You can see the pin right there, and it's since stuck, so we got to get that freed up and oiled up so that way it's moving like so, and we can adjust the drive system when the time is right. I do know that this chain does move. It's going to need some more oil, but that's okay. I am going to have to replace, as a side note, the chain for the sickle bar, because that one's pretty darn stiff, as you guys saw in the beginning of the video. And then we'll have to get this jack shaft all oiled up, make sure that's squared away, and then someday before I come out here and turn the heat on in the morning, I'll probably wire wheel this thing, mainly because there's a lot of dust and this is a small garage. I'll get this wire wheeled, that way it's all cleaned up, so when the belts go on it, it's not gritty or anything like that. So the first thing we're going to do is get this wheel and tire off of here, that way we can access the differential and everything behind it. Unfortunately, these are too close to the hub in the middle to be able to get a ratchet or anything on them, so you got to use a wrench. But so far they are breaking free, so that's good. That'll do it. Alright, so that's our differential setup. As you can see, they're both spinning at 2 different speeds. Got a grease fitting here, which is always nice. So that still spins pretty darn well. So it's just going to be a matter of getting some oil on that getting everything lubed up real nice. Shouldn't have to do all too much to that. And really the hardest part's going to be getting this arm here freed up so that way it moves like so again. So let's get some penetrating oil down there, and we can see about getting that thing to start walking back and forth again. So I loosened up these bolts right here, and it's not the easiest thing to tell, but we do have movement on that shaft. I was able to get this to move a little bit with getting some oil in behind it, and I was working it back and forth quite a bit. I took this linkage off here so that way I can muscle it back and forth and try to free it up, but it's not freeing up very well. I know there's probably a lot of old dried up grease inside of there, so I just got to that point where I'm just going to take this entire bracket setup off of here, and then we can clean everything up in the parts washer and then reassemble it with some fresh grease and all that fun stuff. That way I know it's going to move and properly engage the belt when we get everything back together. So that'll make it a lot easier to clean up. So those are the two halves that go around the axle. A little spacer plate right there, and then of course the jack shaft, if you want to call it that, the casting with the pulley and everything that runs through there down to the chain. So that'll give me a chance to get this chain freed up really nicely. I can work that around on the bench, and then I think I'm going to leave this differential together. Everything seems to be moving pretty darn well. I'm just going to make sure it's all greased up when it goes back together, and we can go from there. So once again, I'll get all this stuff degreased, ran through the parts washer, and then I can start with reassembly. Drive system components are all put back on. So I got some fresh grease down inside of here where everything wraps around the axle. There's a spacer plate that goes between these three bolts here and this other receiving plate on the other side, but there isn't one down below here, and I'm starting to wonder maybe if one got lost in transition over the years, because this does clamp down around the axle when everything's snug down. It's not as loose as what I would like it to be, but that's the way it's going to stay for now. The plate on the back side of this is threaded, so I was able to thread these bolts in, and then there's nuts that hold on this chain guard, so I was able to tighten up against the chain guard and then just keep everything snug. So it is gripping that axle a little bit, but it could be a little bit looser. So the differential unit itself, I get that all greased and oiled up, and everything spins pretty darn nice right now. So we're going to be in good shape. Chain is oiled up and all that. So the next thing I'm going to do is get this tire back on here just for the time being, just to get the thing off of the jack. And then I'm going to start by working on these handles up here. One of them is for the drive system right here, and then the other one here is for the sickle bar drive. And of course, as I had mentioned, I got to get this little casting brazed up right here and taken care of. Alrighty folks, that's going to be it for part 2, just to keep this video at a reasonable length. So in part 3, we're going to be getting the new tires onto this thing, rebushing the sickle bar drive components, along with getting the clutch and everything back together, remounting the engine, and finalizing that drive system, and just getting this thing all wrapped up and ready to go. So until the next one folks, there you have it. Well folks, we're going to be moving on to part 3 of the Toro Parkway Sickle Bar mower revamp. So we're going to start off with this one in getting these levers squared away, at least disassembled, greased, and then get everything so I can adjust it again, because I know this turnbuckle here, or this yoke that's on the end of it, this one does move. I know this one's stuck, the pin is stuck in here, so I just want to get all that stuff freed up and ready to adjust for when the engine goes back to it. And I'm also going to get the sickle bar mower drive handle, which is this one here that engages the sickle bar clutch. I need to get this piece off of here, as I'd mentioned a couple of times, and then we're going to prep this for brazing and get that clamped down to a plate and everything V'd out. That way I can braze it and get that bracket on there as well. levers and linkages have all been pulled off. So as you can see here on this cross shaft, where the two levers go up to the, what you'd call the dash, I guess you could say, is somebody had drilled a hole through this one, which would have been for the ground drive system. So I don't know if they had issues with this thing coming loose time and time again, and they tried to roll pin it, but there was no roll pin in there, because as you guys saw, you might have, but there was a set screw here, there's supposed to be one here, which is now just an empty hole in the arm, and then of course there's two set screws above each woodruff key on top. But I'm not going to put a roll pin through it. I'm just going to get this shaft all nice and cleaned up along with the arm, and then I'll just put the set screws back into it. That should be enough to hold it. And as for the linkages, these I'm just going to work on in the vise and get everything freed up and oiled up again. That way it can get reassembled and properly adjusted. And then of course, as I had mentioned, I get a little bit of grinding to do on this thing and see if I can get it jigged up properly, so that way we can go ahead and braze it. So the majority of our linkages are all back together for the drive system. As you can see, everything is moving accordingly and all that. So what I did do is I left these yokes loose on the shafts, so that way when the engine goes back in and the belts go on, I can get everything adjusted accordingly for the correct belt tension. And of course now the only thing left we have to do is the linkage for the sickle bar clutch. So what I did is I have the arm that was broken set up on a plate here. And what I'm going to do is end up V'ing this out and brazing it. As you can see, somebody did try to weld it at one point, but unfortunately they never V'd it out, and you can see there really wasn't much meat on that weld going around it, holding it on there. So what I also did is I measured from this plate up to this arm, which was 13/16, and I have steel stacked accordingly to that height. So what I can do is V this piece out and then clamp it down here with a C-clamp, and then I'll be able to braze it and have everything remain that uniform factory height, like so, and it'll be able to cool like that as well. Alrighty, so this is what we ended up with after we get this lever braze back together, and everything took really well, I will say. The pictures that you just saw, I had it V'd out almost all the way to the bottom. There was just a little bit connecting both parts, and everything flowed in really nice. It wet into the cast iron really well too, and I was able to, I built the whole top up here, and then I wet it around the sides, and then what I did is I was able to take it off of the plate and flip it over, and I put a bead on the bottom as well just to close it all up. It didn't burn through the way that I was hoping it would with that little bit on the bottom, but it did take very nicely to the cast iron, so I feel pretty darn good about that braze holding up. So I'm going to get this all cleaned up. I'm going to bust this flux and everything off of here that's left over, that resin looking stuff, and then we'll get that mounted back onto the sickle bar. Clutch arm is all mounted back up and greased up, so that's all set to go. When the bushings come in for this, we'll get the sickle bar mower clutch put back onto it, and then that'll be all squared away. So in the meantime, what we are going to do is get this engine mounted back in the frame and get the drive pulley back onto the back of the reduction box there, and then we can measure and see what we're going to need for drive belts for this. So I have the engine just sitting in here right now. The mounting bolts are through it, but they're just finger tight. That way it just holds it in place. Because when this sickle mower clutch goes back on, the only way to adjust this chain here, the slack in it, is to move this engine back and forth, as it has slotted holes on the engine cradle. So what I did is I just have it setting about where it came out of when I pulled the engine 2 years ago, because you can still see the marks on the rails. And I figured that'll be close enough to figure out what this drive belt is going to be. So what I did is I backed off these yokes on the threaded rods, so there's about 1/4 of an inch left inside of the yoke, and that way it'll give me enough forward throw
to tighten the belt, and then hopefully enough on the return swing to loosen it, because there's not a lot of throw to this pulley, as you can see, but when it comes up, it almost always hits this tube depending on where it's adjusted. So I have to make sure there's enough forward throw. That way when it comes back, it also disengages from here, and the residual drag from the pulleys when it's not tensioned does not keep creeping the machine along, but we'll have to see how that goes. So what I tried to do is the old rope trick, where you take a piece of rope and you wind it around the pulleys down in the bottom of the groove and measure it, and that would have been 38 inches. And then of course I found a belt here, which is a 4L 380, 38 inch belt, 4L, which is 1/2 inch wide. And this will take a wider belt, the 5L belts, or a B belt, which is, I believe those were 5/8 wide. But for the sake of not having it drag when there's two belts on here, I am going to put a 1/2 inch wide belt on it so I can double them up and don't have to worry as much about just the tension of the belt, more surface area on the pulley dragging it when it's in neutral. So I tried that belt out, and unfortunately it is way too small. So what I'm going to have to do is pick up a few belts from the bearing place and just see what works on here for a belt. And then once I figure out the size or get darn close to it, I'll get a couple of those belts, and then we'll be good on the drive system. Alrighty, our new tires finally came in, so I'm looking forward to getting these mounted up. And folks, this is something that I rarely do when I revamp old equipment and go through machinery, for myself at least. New customers, or customers, I will put new tires on their equipment and so on if that's what they desire to have done to it. But I'm pretty thrifty when it comes to going through my own stuff, and I rarely ever spend money on putting new tires on things unless absolutely necessary. And this sort of ended up meeting that criteria, because as you can see, this tire is flat over here and they are pretty well dry rotted. When I found this thing, it was sitting in the dirt, probably about 5 or 6 inches buried, and you can see the dry rot on these tires. And the one over here is actually holding air, and has been since I got it, but you can just see how badly cracked it is. And I think these are only 2-ply tires, so there's only one really crispy dry ply holding that together with the tube inside of it. And generally I'll break down these tires, I'll put patches on the inside of them, I'll retube them. And I've done this with Gravely's before in the past, and I have had them hemorrhage. And even the tires on the 4-wheel drive, when I took that to plow day last year, those looked like they were pretty good tires, but the fatigue from working them while plowing, they ended up splitting on the sides and hemorrhaging, and most likely these are going to do the same thing. Granted, they weren't working that hard, but you can see they're just in really, really tough shape. Very crustaceous, I guess you could say, or just dry rotted. So I ended up finding these on eBay. They were the cheapest ag tires that I can find that were 512s. They're just an off-brand overseas name, and it was 155 bucks shipped for both tires and tubes as well. They came as a set, and you really couldn't beat the price. So I figured I'd just do it and retire this thing. Unfortunately, I think I should have gone with 412s instead of the original 512 size, because tire sizing is just a little bit different nowadays, and I think these are just the sidewalls look a little bit wider. I know the treads are going to stand a little bit taller, and unfortunately this thing, granted this one's also flat and ballooned out, but we don't exactly have a lot of room to play with here, folks, as you can see, for the clearance. So what I'm going to do, because this tire is still holding air, is I'm going to take this wheel off over here. We're going to break this one down and get one of these mounted up and then see how the clearance is. I'd rather sacrifice the junk tire versus the one that's holding air. And worst case, if I have to order a set of 412 ags, I'll find something to put these 512s on, or I'll resell them or something like that to a customer. So anyways, folks, let's get this wheel off of here and see about getting this crusty tire broken down. So before I go ahead and wire wheel this wheel, just to clean it up before the new tire goes on, I wanted to show you guys, I don't know if this is the original Toro green, because it's a little bit lighter than what I've been finding on this machine, but it very well could have been that they painted before the tires went on. But I saw these markings on the side which I thought were kind of neat, and nearest I can figure it's a date and the size. So we have 7-41, which would be July of 1941, and then here we have 12, if the camera picks this up, 12 by 3.0, so a 12-inch rim and 3 inches wide. I got all the heavy rust and the crust off for where the bead sits for the tire. I didn't bother with the paint because obviously that's still in good shape for the most part, but I just wanted to get this surface cleaned up. Granted, these are going to be tubed tires, but I want to make sure that that tire is going to set nicely on here, and it's going to make it a lot easier to put in here as well with all that rust gone. So before I go ahead and mount this tire, what I did do is wipe the inside of the rim down with a really oily rag just to coat it for any moisture or anything like that so it doesn't rust up again. Sometimes when I have more time on my hands, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll paint the inside of the rims just with some Rust-Oleum paint and seal everything up once I wire wheel it, and it'll make it just that much more protected against any rust or moisture that gets into there. And I'm also, because I don't have any bead butter mixed up and sometimes the WD gets a little messy, I'm just wiping the inside of the bead on the tire as well with a really oily rag. That way everything, in theory, should slide onto this rim fairly decent. Run a little bit of WD around that bead again, because the tires will soak up the oil. I mean, that's what they make them out of. They're petroleum-based product. So what I'm going to do is clamp one side of this rim, if I can make my way in here. So I clamp one side like so. Kind of make sure the tube is out of the way of the pry bar, and now that'll hold it underneath the bead, or it'll hold the bead underneath the rim of the tire, and I can usually work my way around it to some degree and have everything set underneath fairly nicely. Alright, that's sitting in there nice. Bead looks like it's seated nice on there. Put a little more wind in it just to make sure.
So that's at about 32 pounds right now, which is plenty to seat the bead. We're going to air them down some. Alright, so we're sitting at about 10 right there. Everything's still seated up nice. So we'll get the axle cleaned up and get the slip back on and see how we're doing for clearance. So we just have enough room on this side with this tire mounted up. As you can see, it's just skiffing by that inner rail right there, and then the stabilizer bar on the outside edge. The lug just taps the head of that bolt, as you can see when it goes by, but it's not enough where I'm really concerned about it. These wheels do have some play with the age of the machine, obviously enough, but it's not like it's digging in really far down on the lug. So as it drives along, that'll be just fine, having that bolt tapping like that. Unfortunately, the size difference between 40s tires and tires nowadays is kind of significant. I ran into this a lot over the years working on Gravely's and the gear reduction wheels, especially when I was replacing tires for customers. It was hard to find a new tire with the same profile as the old Goodyear Sure Grips that they used on those, and the tire profile is a lot higher on new tires like this one is, even though it's a 512 or a 5x12, or on the Gravely's there were 4x12s. They're a little bit wider and a little bit taller, so unfortunately not everything always fits perfect, but this one does fit enough where it's not dragging on anything, and it'll work just fine. So we're going to get that other side changed out, and then we'll have two brand new tires on this thing. This right hand side, the rim was pretty darn crusty on it, so it took a little bit of doing to get it wire wheeled, and I chipped all the blister rust and everything off, and luckily it wasn't rotted through anywhere, so no pinholes. But the new tire is all mounted up with the new tube in it, and luckily enough we have plenty of clearance. Alright folks, we're getting up to the tail end of this revamp here. So this week I ended up picking up the bushings for this from the bearing place, and unfortunately none of these fit, which is kind of a bummer, but I ended up going with a lot of metric bushings here because the American size, the SAE size bushings I could not find for this. And when they manufactured this machine, I think there was a lot of custom sized bushings made for this versus standard size, and I cut some footage out of part 2 because this is sort of irrelevant now, but I'll just sort of bring you guys up to speed really quick. I think I talked about replacing the bushings in this arm because they were so worn out. So this arm has an oddball inside diameter to it, whereas this pin right here has a standard outside diameter. So this pin is 1 1/8 inches, and the inside of this arm, if I remember correctly, let's see, it is between 1 3/8 inches and 1 7/16 inches. So it's an odd size, and you can't get bushings of that size. So what I did is I found metric equivalents that would be darn close. But unfortunately, the metric equivalents, they will not fit over this pin, but they will press into this arm here. And unfortunately, I also don't have a lathe to spin any of these off on to make them the correct size so that they will fit. So unfortunately, we're going to be putting all the old bushings back into this thing. And really the worst ones were in this arm, just because it takes the brunt of the force on this pin of the sickle bar. And I was going to replace them also in this cross shaft here, because they had a little bit of play, but not a significant amount. So that'll be okay as well. And like I said a few times, this isn't going to be getting a lot of use. So I'm really not that worried. I'm just going to keep everything greased up well, and we'll be good. So with that, I was able to find the correct belt for this, the drive belt, which is going to be a 4L400, which is a 1/2 inch wide, 40-inch belt. I picked up a bunch of them from the bearing place, I think I got 37 inches to 42 inches, and just kept fitting each one to see which one will work. So I have to pick up another 40-inch belt, and then we'll have both of our drive belts in for this. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, just to save some time here, is I'm going to get the sickle bar all reassembled, press all these bushings back in, and get that all squared away. And then what I'll do is set up the camera for when I reassemble the drive clutch that goes on the end here, so you guys can see how that goes back together. Linkages for the sickle bar are all mounted back up. As you can see, I've got all the new grease fittings in there, and everything is greased. Everything moves really nicely as well. And the actuator lever on the side is wood. So what I'm doing to this, just to preserve it, because this is going to be covered outside, but moisture and stuff's still going to get to it. So what I'm doing is I'm sanding down the wood part of the actuator lever here with some sandpaper, just to get that kind of soft, punky film on the edge of the wood off. And then I'm going to be wiping it down
with some boiled linseed oil just to help preserve it while it's sitting outside. So clutch is all assembled. Now the last thing I have to do is just adjust these lock bolts, I guess you could call them, on the sides here. That way we can get proper clutch pressure when this thing gets engaged. So we're going to leave these right about here right now, and then when I get a chance to give this a test run in some vegetation, we can finalize the adjustment. It's hard to tell. I don't know how much pressure it's going to take for this clutch to grab, and I don't want to wind it down so tight that I end up breaking anything. So we're going to leave it right about there for the time being. Well folks, jumping ahead a few months, as you can see here, the Toro Sickle Bar is all back together and functioning again. So let's take this over to the horse farm and do a little bit of mowing. So as you guys saw, I ran into a little bit of an issue when I was cutting there on that last clip. This bar right here that couples the sickle bar to the drive on the side over here, this kept falling out. The pins that are in it are very worn out, and you guys saw I made an attempt to bush it in the video. And it worked out for a little while, but unfortunately, with this thing smacking back and forth the way it does, it just beat the snot out of the original bushings that were in there. So I'm going to have to come up with a new design for this thing, and I have some stuff in mind to get that repaired. But anyways, folks, it's really nice to have this thing back together. This has been a long time in the running. As you saw, the first video I filmed in 2023, and of course here we are in late summer of 2025, and everything's all back together and functioning again. Brought this to the local tractor show last week, and I've got a little bit of attention because it's an odd piece by the Toro company. It's not one that you really ever see, actually, and I've never seen one at another New England show, even though this is the New England Toro company. And I've only seen one photo of this exact model online. I have not been able to find any information on them, as I believe I had mentioned in the first video, or any other pictures or anyone that owns one of these things. So it's definitely a rare piece. I think Toro sold a lot to golf courses back in the day, and they have some really cool equipment from that era, but it's very scarce because I believe either municipalities or golf courses were the only one that were buying the stuff. But anyways, this is also the nicest sickle bar I've used, just as a side note. And I've ran quite a few of the older ones, but this one just, it cuts nice and everything lays right down into the middle of it very well, and it rarely ever gets bunched up. So Toro definitely had a good design with this sickle bar unit right here. So anyways, folks, hope you enjoyed the repair and startup series. And that's all for now for the 1940s Toro Parkway Sickle Bar Mower.